Welcome back, AP. Oh man, sorry for posting a little bit later than normal, but I had to go see my niece Lennon yesterday, and she takes a little bit of time, away from like work things because she's very, very cute and very, very squishy, as you can see right here. All right, so, but we left off in class talking about class consciousness, Denny's favorite figure, Karl Marx, talking about the ideas of like the growth of societal classes and the change and the differentiation between like your old nobility upper class, your industrial middle class, which is becoming almost like your prototypical upper class now in the eyes of the industrial working class, right? Being down at the bottom. Now, again, the scary part is the idea that like we now have entered into a phase of history where people are completely aware of the class of which they reside in, right? And this, of course, this term was coined by Karl Marx, right? Now, he's not the only guy to pick up and notice these things, right? Some of you are like, communism. Well, hold on. Karl Marx has not even come up with his ideas on communism yet, all right? His pamphlet doesn't gain notoriety or popularity until 1889, right? And also, he wasn't alone. Another guy actually wrote this with him, okay? His name was Frederick Engels, who was also massively affected by the Industrial Revolution, right? He was Marx's partner. He wrote diatribes about the conditions of the working class, right? He said, I charge the middle class with murder, destruction, and the all-out persecution of the working class, right? So Frederick Engels also was a big proponent going against the ideas of class differentiation in the Industrial Revolution, and that the industrial middle class was actually persecuting that of the lower working class, which history and revisionism has provided us with a different lens to look through. It might not have been all that bad. What you've learned in like high school, middle school, everything in life up to this point is that the Industrial Revolution was bad, factory conditions are bad, everything is bad, everyone's poor now except for this small little part of society. It's not necessarily true, and we'll get into that today, and how it's a little bit more varied. But the seeds of communism were planted during the Industrial Revolution, right? And I don't care what anybody says, it's still a dope symbol regardless of your government affiliations. Now, anyway, so the industrial middle class, right? You see that title right there, the industrial middle class. Let's talk about who these people are a little bit, right? Let's like get into them a little bit. Well, they were spurred on by this idea of competition, right? So before we go anywhere, you need to go ahead and get out of your mind that the industrial middle class was this group of people from the nobility who took a step down and then decided to involve themselves into the factory. A lot of people are asking themselves, they're like, oh, well, then it's the old bourgeois, Well, no, like the bourgeois had to get wealthy somehow, right? So the thing about it is the industrial middle class was a new thing, and it was a good thing. It was a good thing that this idea of competition had popped up and spurred forward society because they rose from the lower class, right? That's why the bourgeois was in the third estate in the French Revolution. They were a part of that third class, right? They began to compete with one another and vie for factory space, for these new inventions coming out, figuring out ways to take the old putting out system and develop a new economic pattern, right? By the way, I'm going to try and keep this to about 15 minutes because it was a little bit later on a Sunday. And we're going to get as far as we can in that 15 minutes, all right? So the field's going to begin to narrow, though. Because here's the thing, speaking of competition, one word you need to write next to that word competition is also the word risk, all right? So capitalism and the Industrial Revolution revolves around the idea of competition and risk, okay? Just because you had the money to invest in the idea of creating a factory, you might not have been able to penetrate that industrial middle class due to the fact that maybe you set your factory up in a bad spot. Maybe you did it in the wrong time of year. Maybe your workers got really sick. It's a risk, right? It is a risk. And the field began to narrow as only a few people came out on top in these early investments and the growth and the birth of this industrial middle class, right? Because early factory owners did not have a very easy life. They struggled. They struggled to send their kids to school. They highly valued education in the middle class as a way to penetrate the upper echelons of society. And they also had to do certain things to keep their business afloat, like have gigantic loans, have to figure out ways to fix machines constantly. It was not an easy life. And it really wasn't your early entrepreneurs that really grew this industrial middle class and then widened that gap that Karl Marx often refers to. This is like your 1770s middle class, right? It's birth in and of itself. Profits also by the industrial middle class were not kept for themselves. They were actually reinvested, right, in the true capital gains model. You reinvest so you can actually buy new machinery and clear yet new hurdles, right? So their sons, though, were the ones, however, that began to grow that gap between owner and worker. All right. So, and one of the best examples of this is actually that of like Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump he was born into a wealthy family, right? And he was like a part of that industrial middle class in a sense that grew that gap between himself and his workers because he came into an already established wealth pattern, right? And that's not me bashing the guy. That's just factual because his grandfather was a poor German immigrant that actually he's Prussian at the time, came over and actually worked as a barber and a hotel manager and then began to invest in real estate. And then Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father, also then took that model that his father came up with and began to continue to reinvest in areas like Brooklyn and Queens and develop the real estate. And then Donald Trump pivots using money from his father and grandfather's now established setting to invest in Manhattan and grow his wealth fabulously, right? So it's not a bad model. I'm not knocking the man for making money, but he is a good example of how the sons in the early industrial middle class that had been educated by their forefathers are the ones that grow that gap that we often refer to as the giant schism between the industrial middle and the industrial working, right? So women's active role also in the industrial middle class is going to take a nosedive, right? So the big ideas set forward by the French Revolution of politically active women, your Mary Wollstonecrafts, right? Your Mary Shelleys that are going to come up later in life that are advocating for the education of women. The industrial middle class did not serve as a bannerment of continuing that trend. They served as like a bannerment of going backwards, right? Because women's active role in this new class actually took a massive hit. They were encouraged not to participate in politics, encouraged only to be working in the home. They looked down upon working in factories and also being involved in business, right? And men also in industrial middle class families sought out other industrial middle class families who had subservient daughters, and this became a pattern, all right? So we are still feeling these effects today, right? So now, continuing forward, though, the industrial working class is now the group that we're going to get into, and let's check our time real quick. All right, we're perfect. 7 minutes, perfect. All right, so now the industrial working class, when you talk about them, we will talk about where they came from, but we need to talk about where the heck they even got their jobs in the first place. And a lot of it, we got to start with the factories then, right? So work in early factories, when the workers actually began to turn to these things, became a giant conflict between your old putting out system and cottage system versus this new idea of cloth and cotton textile factories. Because those were your first factories. Your first factories were not iron smelting. Your first factories were not major machinery working. They were in cotton textiles, right? And of the 1750s, these things were actually put up, we got to talk about the school versus work model, right? So the best way to describe how this wasn't just like a lights on, everybody run into the factory, find yourself a job kind of moment. There was a lot of early resistance to working in these factories. Many of your industrial working class, your rural poor did not want to work in these factories, right? Because the putting out system and the cottage system provided a great form of life, the industrious revolution. I work at my own pace to then create enough money for me to work and make money and buy luxury items, right? So, and what I like to use, and then whereas the factory system, you had a set schedule you had to be in by, you had to be there or you could lose pay, kids could be beaten if they didn't do their tasks properly, It was a very stressful, very disciplined life. And the way I like to look at that as, you guys are living the high life. Y'all are in the putting out cottage system right now. You're in school, right? You're in high school. You have to come to school, but if you miss a day, we figure it out, right? You have to do certain things, but it's kind of at your own leisurely pace. Like I guarantee some of you aren't even watching this until Monday morning, right? Like that is the putting out system, the relaxed system. And then when you get to my phase of life, when you actually have a job and you are expected to be somewhere at a certain time, and if you don't do all of those things, then you lose your ability to actually survive. Like it's a very much more stressful idea. That's why I highly advise you, stay in school for as long as you can. It's the fun part, right? Work's not the fun part. Well, I love my job, but that's Not everybody does. All right, so the first factories also were not just thrown up in cities. The very first factories actually popped up in the country near rivers and streams. Because remember, the water frame and many of your early factories were powered by running water, not steam yet, right? The steam engine and James Watt's design didn't really come along and get very popular until like the 1790s, almost 1800, right? So your first factories were put up in the country. And workers were also put to fines for infraction. They lost pay, right? So again, no one wanted to work in these factories early on because they could be fined if they were late, or if they messed up product, they had to pay for it. Children were sometimes even beaten by overseers. Now, early factories also, if you look down at the two pictures down here in the, oh, wow, where are we going? Oh, wait, go back. There it is. If you look at these two pictures down here in the bottom, oh my God, come on. You see these two buildings right here and how they look very similar? Well, one of them is a poorhouse. Poorhouses were these things designed by the English government to try and bring in absolutely destitute people on the tax dollar to try and figure out ways to get them into work relocation or feed them and their children. A lot of times it was like split families or war-torn families, things like that. They were called poorhouses or workhouses, right? Where you would actually work to actually earn your bed and your meals, right? Now, if you look at them though, and I asked you which one's a workhouse, which one's a factory, you couldn't tell me the difference, right? So the funny thing is, the nicer designed one right here, that's a poorhouse. This was a textile factory. So many people feared actually turning to these places. They looked at them and they're like, oh, is that a poorhouse or is that a factory? Oh, God. So early reluctance to working in the factories, large-scale child labor from foundling hospitals is going to pop up, right? Your earliest factory force were kids, all right? Your earliest factory force were orphans, your Oliver Twist era, Charles Dickens kind of ideas of using a child to work because adults refuse to work in this and they don't want to abandon this old cottage system of which they've become accustomed to, right? So, there we go. All right, so now getting after it some more. Continuing with the industrial middle class, people like Wordsworth and William Blake describe it perfectly. The animosity and the fear of working in these factories and how it did not just go quietly into the night that these people wanted to run into these factories as fast as they possibly could, because it's just absolutely not the case. Wordsworth wrote like these long poems discussing, what's his big poem? There's one about dandelions and field and stuff like that. Yeah, Wordsworth. So Wordsworth was a big anti-industrialist poet. He would write long poems about nature and getting away from the factories and things like that. William Blake actually went as far as to call them, and don't disappoint Buchanan, I know you've heard these people's names before. William Blake went as far as to call these factories satanic mills, all right? So, which is terrifying. Now, there was also a giant amount of pre-1850 resistance to factories. 1850 still serves as our marquee date of like the Great Exposition with the Crystal Palace and like the peak of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, right? Now, pre-1850 resistance, though, there were actually a group of people that feared working in factories so much and hated it with a fiery passion. They were called Luddites, right? Luddites. Luddites. Luddites would actually run into the factories and use clubs and blunt instruments to destroy the machines to prevent people from working in them out of fear that they may themselves have to turn to this labor one day, right? Oh, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. That's the one you were talking about? Yeah. See, listen to that Wordsworth title. I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Thank you, sweetheart. Now, but the problem is that the enclosure movements, capital needs are going to win out, and the putting out system is going to die. Right? Like, so the putting out system and the cottage system are going to die in favor of the factory model, especially after the invention of the steam engine, right? Now, I don't mean die completely. There were still artisans around, right? Except most of your landless laborers that after the enclosure movement had kind of halved that, like, agricultural labor force, which was still your biggest occupation at the time, was working on a farm. It's going to send them into the cities. And there's going to be massive urbanization looking for work in these cities, right? And also because particularly they were near coal centers, right? This right here is a graph actually of massive urbanization. Urbanization, of course, if you don't know what that word means, is when people were moving from rural areas into city urban areas, right? Now, looking at this right here, this is actually a graph of population growth in Manchester, all right? So Manchester, England. As you can tell in the 1750s, they had actually less than, what is that right there, 90,000. And then as time goes on, the population absolutely skyrocketed following the development of the steam engine and the mass influx of people looking for work in these factories when they actually become fully mechanized, right? So now there's the big thing about it is like this is not all bad, right? There are positives and negatives to this entire thing, right? So let's go through them real quick. And yep, we're coming in perfect on time right now. We're at like 14 minutes, 53 seconds. We're going to wrap this up. And then in class, we'll just have we'll have like 3 slides in class on, and then we're going to just keep, and we're going to start pushing forward with Napoleon, right? So big positives and negatives though. Well, first of all, people are making more money. That's awesome, right? The Industrial Revolution gave up the idea of more wage earning power throughout the home, because now your father can work, your mother can work, and even your child can work. Yay! But that's the big negative. It's like child labor is a very, very huge problem, because sometimes in many like English and Irish factories, kids as young as 5 years old could be possibly sent to factories to work alongside of their mothers. We'll get into the family dynamic of work tomorrow. Now, the ability to buy minor life luxuries is a huge positive, right? You're making money now. It goes into your pocket. You now have the ability to afford that screen to separate your room to create 2 new rooms, or your own spoon and bowl, which was a giant luxury at the time, right? But then a huge negative is to try and get these things, people began to have to work 6 days a week, 11-hour shifts a day. The dramatic increase in rate of work from about 1750 to 1800 was the average worker in 1750 worked about 250 days a week, and then by 1800 they worked 300 days a week, right? That's only 60 days off a year. That's pretty brutal, right? And I know some of y'all right now, like Jillian Kane's like, oh, if I own the factory, they're going to work anyway. Jillian. So bad. Now, wages are also going to rise, though, during times of peace around 1850, right? Wages were actually up 50% as compared to 1780 as they were in about 1850, right? However, wage stagnation before 1850 was a huge problem because of war, division of labor, Napoleon destroying the continent, and the British running out there to try and get him back or trying to stop him, led to a massive, massive amount of inflation. Wait. Come on down. There we go. Led to a massive amount of like inflation and other wage stagnation issues. They did not grow as they should have, right, along with prices. Clothing and diet improved. Nice underwear and new vegetables. That's huge, okay? But the other problem is that the housing market became terrible, because as the urbanization movements actually moved forward, you actually brought in the ideas of tenement housing, or putting as many people into one dwelling as you possibly could, so that family unit could make more money, right? And then also food price fluctuations were a huge issue because of the conflict going on in the continent up until 1850. Wheat distribution, shipments on food coming from the continent or going to the continent or even coming from the colonies were disrupted. And the food price debacle in the Industrial Revolution only ever really affected your poorer classes. It never really affected your industrial middle or even higher up, because they had the wealth to be able to afford prices of food no matter what they were set at, right? So, but hey, everybody's got underwear now, so that's a good thing, you know. Industrial Revolution, cotton underpants, you gotta love it. All right, so, but we will talk to you guys some more on Monday. We're going to talk about how we're going to just kind of shatter some of your ideas or your misconceptions of like sexual division of labor. We're going to shatter the ideas of the factory worker, right? Y'all see it in your mind as like one person per factory, per family, different factories, where actually factories recruited families in total. And we'll get to that on Monday. And we're going to talk about unions as well, or amalgamated societies. Ooh. All right, so we'll talk about that later. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a great weekend. Go anybody but the Patriots. Hope y'all enjoy yourself.